Hello, welcome back. Today, I would like us to take a look at a recent story which went international, relating to a study by a University College London team of archaeologists. The excitement centred around the forensic reconstruction of the ancient remains of Cheddar Man, whose skeletal remains, thought to be around 10,000 years old, were found in Goff's Cave in Somerset. The British press and international media were bursting at the seams in their excitement to inform the world that new DNA testing had revealed evidence suggesting that the earliest people of the British Isles likely had dark skin. Cheddar Man is the oldest complete skeleton yet found in Britain, and that is a point worth keeping in mind. These remains are the most complete, not the oldest. In fact, in the same cave system, many more remains have been discovered which predate this individual by some 5,000 years, and another 50 remains have been discovered within the same area, which appear to be contemporary to Cheddar Man. And here we have a hint that perhaps there is a lack of focus on certain issues. The most notable is an almost complete lack of focus on the science itself. Something is seriously wrong here. To illustrate this, let's take a look at a typical article that covered this story. This article was published online by the Smithsonian, and it is typical of the media presentation of the study. Its header reads, "Early Britain had dark skin and light eyes. DNA analysis shows." What I would like us to pay particular attention to is the typical form of citation used within this and other articles. Let's list these as they appear in the article itself. As Paul Wencon of the BBC reports. As Hannah Devlin of The Guardian explains. Alphonse Kennis, who worked on the reconstruction, tells New Scientist. As Jason Daly of the Smithsonian.com reported. According to the BBC's Wencon, speaking to New Scientist. Do you see an issue here? Who is doing the science? Is it the science journalists or the scientists themselves? If it is the scientists, then where is the science? When we trawl through the articles, we find only vague, often qualified references to any actual science that is being used to support these claims. So what do we know about the science behind the excited headlines? Let's review what we can glean from the articles published so far and flag any potential problems. The first issue has already been hinted at earlier, and that relates to sample size. Cheddar Man is a single individual. Although he has grabbed the collective imagination of the British public since his discovery in 1903, he is not unique, nor the oldest in a larger population of remains. These remains and the artefacts found with them cover a period of between 16,000 to 9,000 years ago. In fact, there is another 50 sets of remains contemporary to Cheddar Man, of which nothing is said. So in this regard, we cannot be certain that Cheddar Man is even typical of the small local population within which he is situated, let alone the entire population of Britain at the time. In fact, there are indications, such as the circumstance that his remains were isolated, and he did not seem to have been deliberately buried, which might indicate he was atypical. The next potential issue we should seriously consider is the presentation of genetic science. What we should be mindful of is that most of the claims made by the UCL team had already been established by non-genetic archaeological methods. The references to farming, the lactose intolerance within certain populations are well understood, the most likely haplogroup already known. The claims made by the UCL team, however, are quite specific. They relate to a single individual and can only be determined genetically. This leads us to the first potential problem, in that the sample is 10,000 years old. DNA is a complex biological structure which begins to degrade almost immediately after cell death. This breakdown of structure can be accelerated by the presence of enzymes, bacteria, and groundwater. Groundwater is ubiquitous in cave systems. Studies have established the half-life of DNA, and it is considerably longer than one might suppose, but it amounts to 521 years. If we do the maths, that would imply that only 0.0007% of the DNA would be intact in this particular sample. So even without knowing the exact condition of the sample extracted by the UCL team, it would be surprising if the team had the luxury of a complete genome. which is one of the claims made or attributed to the UCL study. It may be the case that this individual was an exception. The conditions were such that the DNA was extremely well preserved. But what percentage was actually recovered? It looks like we will have to wait until publication to find out. There are two other issues that might be of concern. Both are relatively obvious. The first issue is reliance on an earlier study, and the second issue relates to methodology. And this second issue, while only hinted at, is somewhat troubling. In an article on the Natural History Museum's website, researcher Tom, presumably Tom Booth, stated the following, and I quote, "We had a lot of genetic data, but you have to kind of know what you're looking for," says Tom. "I had taken a recreational DNA test that looked specifically at physical traits, and they had helpfully listed the markers they used to come up with their assessments. We were able to send that list of markers to our own bioinformatics lab to help us develop a portrait of Cheddar Man." What the hell is going on here? Let's try to reconstruct this series of events so we are clear about the methodological foundation used in this study. First, one of the researchers, having sent a sample of his DNA to a commercial DNA company, like 23andMe for analysis, or maybe it was sent to a company called Oxford Ancestors, which is run by Professor Brian Sykes, who we shall meet later on in our adventure because his sticky fingerprints are all over this project. Anyway, our scientist Tom was so impressed with his results, he decided to give the genetic markers that had been used to determine his own ancestry by the unnamed commercial company to his own bioinformatics lab, so they could use these same markers to determine traits in Cheddar Man, who is at least 300 generations distant. What are we to make of this? The reason why this might be of interest, and why I had trouble to name the CEO of Oxford Ancestry, will become obvious as we continue our adventure. Whichever way you look at it, it all sounds a bit dubious to say the least. But did they find these magic markers? Of course not. In a Guardian article we find the following, and I quote, "The team homed in on genes known to be linked to skin colour, hair colour and texture and eye colour. For skin tone, there are a handful of genetic variants linked to reduced pigmentation, including some that are very widespread in European populations today. However, Cheddar Man had ancestral versions of these genes, strongly suggesting that he would have had dark to black skin tone, but combined with blue eyes. So Cheddar Man had ancestral versions of these genes. That's a nice turn of phrase. Unfortunately, we don't know what it might mean, but we are to presume it is these ancestral genes that suggest dark to black skin. So the questions are now piling up, and the probability of publication is decreasing the further we adventure into this study. How did they determine which genes are ancestral? How confident are they in this determination? Did they trouble themselves to involve a competent geneticist? In other words, where is the evidence? The other issue relates to why the UCL team felt compelled to home in on genes known to be linked to skin colour. In several articles, reference is made to an earlier study, and this is also the source of the 10% of the UK population is related to Cheddar Man statistic. This study was published in 1997 by Professor Brian Sykes, the same Brian Sykes who is CEO of Oxford Ancestry. His paper's uninspired title was Cheddar Man. It was pretty much debunked at the time, and a link to a study which references this paper will be in the description box below. But to save you the trouble, it turns out that he simply got the genetics wrong. In fact, the best explanation anyone could propose for the results is storage or sample contamination. Significantly, however, the original research has never been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So how Sykes actually arrived at his conclusions remains a mystery, but it gets worse for the UCL team. If the UCL archaeological team had troubled themselves to look at the UCL molecular and cultural evolution lab pages, they would have discovered a detailed dismantling and unflattering analysis of Sykes' scientific efforts, including his efforts relating to Bigfoot, Yeti, and perhaps slightly more embarrassing for our archaeological brains trust, a damning criticism of the Cheddar Man paper they had referenced. As is often the case when things look bad, there is always a non-zero probability it could get a lot worse. And yes, indeed, it gets worse, because apparently the Institute of Genetics at Oxford University, which Sykes had used as his affiliation for his article, did not in fact exist. The UCL article described Sykes as engaged in genetic astrology, but perhaps most damning for the purposes of this video is the fact that Sykes was involved in another Channel 4 production called Bigfoot Files, and now we have this study featured in a new Channel 4 production. This might be a coincidence, of course, but if so, it is highly embarrassing for University College London. It also does not reflect well on the archaeological team's research, which it seems failed to find damning evidence of scientific negligence, even when the evidence for it is published on their own university's website. Now, there is nothing wrong with publishing books aimed at popularizing science, but if we have an academic publishing books on the Yeti and contributing to documentaries about Bigfoot, that might raise a few eyebrows. When his work attracts serious criticism from other academics working within relevant fields, that should be of concern. But when the Royal Society itself feels compelled to step in to make corrections to published work, then surely that should have tripped some alarm bells within the UCL archaeological department, but apparently not. And this is the standard of scholarship and diligence which lay at the core of this project. If these were the only issues of concern, then one might be sympathetic to science journalists who had simply regurgitated the Channel 4 press releases. But the UCL team had made several pronouncements relating to general science, which were obviously nonsense. The whole vitamin D and farming issue is total bollocks. Firstly, most mammals, and that includes humans, make vitamin D by exposure to sunlight. Any vitamin D present in the diet is supplementary. Even if you don't believe this is the case for some reason, then what were these new Europeans milking in order to develop their tolerance for lactose? That's right, they were milking cattle. They had access to meat sources and fish, probably never enough. But to link lighter skin colour to agriculture, rather than lack of UV exposure, is simply nonsense. Even the most slow-witted journalist should have picked up on that. I shall leave it to you to ponder why they had not challenged this thesis. Before we end our adventure together, I'd like to make a few points. Firstly, I'm not suggesting that the UCL study is wrong. It might well be perfectly accurate. But in order for this to be the case, we would have to believe 6 impossible things. That the sample DNA was remarkably well preserved in a cave system with groundwater present. That the sample produced complete DNA for analysis, as claimed. That the UCL team had accurately determined ancestral genes and then identified those genes in the sample. That the work of Sykes is credible. That the UCL team's agricultural hypothesis is sound. I shall leave it to you to decide if any or all of these are likely to be true or not. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.